Before I invite Andy up, I have a couple of quick announcements. I just want to let you guys know about some things we have coming up at Redeemer. This is a quick outlook of our content over the next several weeks. We've got some exciting things. So Andy's leading us through this series on wisdom in your wallet. He started last week, set us up beautifully with that biblical framework, and he's continuing that this week and next week. Then we're going to have a fun kind of one-off where Austin has just decided that he wants to go all out on a difficult topic. And so we're going to be talking about AI, Jesus AI, and the battle for humanity. So that's going to be exciting. And then it gets even spicier because we're going to have an Ask Your Pastors Anything night. And so we have a QR code. If you would like to go ahead and submit your questions, it's helpful if we have those questions in advance so that our pastors can prepare for that. If you would like to scan that, I am going to put that down here in a second. I do have that handout in the back, so you don't need to worry and rush right now. You can scan that on your way out and submit your questions to us. You know, Pastor Austin's not here to defend himself, so make him really spicy. Make him tough on him. And then I pray that I'm not on that panel. And then after that, we are going to be, it's, you know, kind of an exciting week around here, Holy Week. We're entering into one of the biggest liturgical seasons, if not the biggest liturgical season of the Christian calendar. And we have a lot of things going on here for Holy Week. And so there is another handout at the back for you with a QR code that has a schedule of all of the things that we have going on here at Redeemer. And so we're really excited to be celebrating Holy Week with you guys. So make sure that you scan that on your way out this evening so that you have that in your calendars. You know everything that's going on. And then after Holy Week, we are kicking off a new series that leads us up to Pentecost. We're going to be looking at the book of Acts and we're doing the secrets of revival, unpacking the power of the early church. So big promises there. Really looking forward to that with you guys. That's going to be a great series, and then we will culminate that series with a special night of ministry on Pentecost, and so that's going to be really special. So if you want to keep up to date with everything that's going on and have updates, emails sent to you so that you know the schedule and speakers and special events, you can scan the QR code on the screen. We also have them on some posters throughout the sanctuary and then out there as well to make sure that you're keeping up to date with everything. All right. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and invite Andy up here because he's got a lot of good things to share with us. Andy, let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for Andy and for his heart and just the things that you have laid on his heart. I thank you for his hard work in preparation for this. And Lord, just pray that you would bless him, that you would speak through him to us. And we pray that through Andy, you would help us to become better stewards of our money. Lord, that our relationship with money would become better. And Lord, that you would just bless him and just grateful for the work that he's put into this. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sam. Are we good?
I think
so. Try again here. There we go. You guys hear me? All right. Well, thanks for coming back for week 2. I'm excited to get into this tonight. We got a lot to go through. First, apologies. Someone notified me. Is it a little loud? We good? Someone let me know at the end of the talk last week that my QR code didn't work, so actually it expired during the talk, so good timing on my part. This one should work, so I would love questions and feedback. Okay, so just to remind you guys of the roadmap, last week we spent a lot of time going through a few different scriptural texts and laying my proposed framework for how we should think as Christians about money. Tonight, we're going to use that framework, and I'm going to give you 10 practical tips for living that godly, wise, and healthy financial life. And then, if I haven't bored you completely, come back for one more week next week, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how. Like, how do we actually do it to make sure that the kingdom gets more and we waste less? So, for those of you that weren't here last week, there were a few goals and objectives that I set forth. So, one, we're going to try to stay extremely biblically grounded here. The second is, and you'll see this very clearly in what we talked through tonight, this is not a series just about giving, right? We talked about this is a holistic talk and lecture series about money and how we can do that well for the kingdom. We're going to get really practical. You'll see that tonight as well as next week. And then my goal is to keep this relevant across life stages. We got a lot of different ages in the room, a lot of different levels of financial acumen. But at the same time, I'm going to talk about a lot of different stuff tonight, and it's not nearly enough time unless you guys want to stay till 11 or 12 with me. So this is going to be an introduction and hopefully give you enough fodder to go deeper or come talk to me afterwards. One boring but obligatory note, as I mentioned last week, general biblical perspective and general financial education. Don't take any of this as personal investment, tax, or legal advice, so make sure to talk to a qualified professional about that. All right, so like last week, we're going to start off with small group discussions. So I want you guys to get into groups of 3 or 4, and 2 questions to discuss. The first is this: what's the number one thing that you want to teach your kids about money? If you don't have kids, think about what would you teach your younger self. And if you have time, second bonus question is, how is your financial life different because you are a Christian? All right? We got about 5 minutes, so pair up, get into groups of 3 and 4, and discuss. All right, we're going to bring it back together. Hopefully everybody got a chance to share something with their group. So I'm going to cheat, though, guys, because I gave you one thing that you got to tell your kids, and I'm going to get to do 10 tonight. So sorry, that's not quite fair, I know. So before I get to my 10 tips, this was our financial framework that I proposed for the Christian life. For those of you that weren't here last week, this was the kind of culmination of the discussion. We talked about 7 buckets: earn faithfully, give generously, spend strategically, save aggressively, invest wisely, and all along the journey, steward taxes and navigate uncertainty. So we'll use this today as we talk about our 10 tips. So, last thing before we get to the tips, I do just want to call out, I could talk about this for the whole rest of the week. So if you gave me 3 hours, there might be 20 or 30 tips. And you'll see that sometimes I embedded a couple into one tip, so again, forgive me. But so this isn't exhaustive, right? There's more to say on the topic. And again, this is intended to spark your thinking, right? Do the math. I've got about 3 to 4 minutes per tip, so we're not going to be able to go super, super deep. But again, let's kind of be holistic in our discussion. And lastly, this is what I want to teach my kids. Some of you might disagree with a couple of my tips. That's okay. I love a healthy debate, so come find me afterwards. The other thing I'd say is, as we go through this, and we've got handouts at the end where we've got a printout of each of the 10 things we'll discuss tonight, and so you can grab one on your way out. You'll probably look at it and say, but Andy, wouldn't you recommend a lot of these even for a non-Christian? And I would, because I believe this is biblically wise and financially healthy advice, and a lot of it is going to apply equally to Christians and non-Christians. But here's my question for you. You guys remember these books, Where's Waldo? Everybody read these? So there's a lot going on, but you got to find the Waldo. So my challenge for you, and I'll try to help us through this as we go through the tips, is while each tip might not be something that it might be something that also a non-Christian would want to follow, I'm going to suggest that as Christians, and specifically as we think about the Christian virtue of humility, if we can think about how to embody humility, we should be postured in a better position to take advantage of some of these tips. So help me look for that thread as we go through. All right, we ready? Here is my tip number 1, and we're going to work our way through the framework. So within the earn faithfully bucket, tip number 1 is consider one-way doors prayerfully. So our inspiration here is going to be from Luke chapter 14 when Jesus says, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.'" Okay, so what is a one-way door? So here we're talking about in the context of a highly consequential decision. It's a little bit difficult to reverse, that in this context will likely shape your future income potential. It's not a good decision or a bad decision. It's just a consequential one that's a little bit more difficult to reverse. So you might think about, picking a field of study, or if you up the ante a little bit, graduate school, or maybe a medical professional thinking about what specialty to go into, right? These are things that once done, they oftentimes take a lot of money, a lot of time, and it's harder to sometimes rewind the clock and go back. So I'll give you a personal example from my own life. Austin mentioned last year, at this point it's starting to get, or last week I should say, at this point, college is starting to feel like quite a long time ago, but he mentioned that when I was an undergrad at Duke, I double majored in economics and religion. What my parents could attest to is I thought about pretty much every other major that was available as well. And I was this close to majoring in religion with a minor in economics. I'm really glad I finished out my double major in economics because I decided, at the ripe age of 21 or whatever it was, that actually I wanted to go into an economics-related field. And it turns out that those types of companies were willing to pay me a whole lot more attention because I had the major. So again, wasn't a right decision or a wrong decision, but I think as I would guide my kids is to think about if you're going to make decisions that are, like I said, more of a one-way door, you need to do so prayerfully, but I think there's also a couple other strategies that we can get from Scripture to help us through these situations. So, number one is kind of what we talked about, do your homework, right? I think that's what we take from Luke chapter 14, right, about building the tower and making sure we do our diligence in advance. The second piece of advice here is seek counsel. So from Proverbs 15, we learn, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. And the third thought is, how do you hedge uncertainty, right? And so, from James, we read in James chapter 4, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. And then he points out, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. I read a stat the other day that only 27% of people, of college grads, have a job that's related to their major, right? So I think there's a sense of, we don't know exactly what the future's going to bring. And so, listen to God's call, use our church around us, right? Pastor Sean says all the time, we're not in this journey alone, right? So we need to be very prayerfully thinking, especially when we get to these one-way doors that will shape the rest of our financial life. So where's my Waldo on this one? I think it's just a recognition as Christians that we don't know everything that the future has in store. So we need to very prayerfully pressure test some of these key decisions. All right, tip number 2, as we move to give generously. We talked some about the theology of this last week. We're going to talk about the how next week. So this week I'll just say tithing is not a natural thing to do. The average giving rate in the United States is about 2%. If you zero in on active donors and higher income folks, it jumps to 4%. It's actually the lower income brackets that on a percentage basis tend to give the most, but it's not a natural thing to do. We talked a little bit about some of these things last week, right? About us being God's stewards. We talked about how it's important that giving should come first. That's a reason why in the framework, as soon as we've earned faithfully, the very next thing is give generously. We talked about Malachi's, calling the people to task and saying, give your full tithe. And in Paul and 2 Corinthians, giving should be done cheerfully. But today, I'm going to talk about starting to tithe now. I think the human mind is absolutely a genius at coming up with reasons why we shouldn't tithe. So let's click through a couple of those. The first being, yeah, it's a good idea, but I'm going to do it next year. And I would just say it's a slippery slope, right? Make the decision once, not force yourself to do it 1,000 times. The other thing you hear people say sometimes is, well, I'm just going to give when I feel moved. But I think we're called to tithe, not just to tip when we hear a good sermon. The third temptation is, well, I'll just tithe when I make more. But the Bible's pretty clear that, when we show that we're mature with small things, then we're blessed with larger things. I guarantee if you're not tithing at $40,000, you won't find a way to do it at $400,000. And then the fourth temptation is, I'll tithe once I have enough. And I think the verse in Proverbs is very clear, right? We're to give from the first fruits. And the other thing is, you look at all the research on this topic, most people never get to enough, right? You ask people at any wealth level, how much is enough? And they point to the bracket above. And then those people are pointing to the bracket above them, right? It's a moving goalpost. And so that leads us back to now, right? Start tithing now. So where's our... I'll give you a personal self-confession here, a personal story, and a bonus tip embedded. When I first graduated from college and was faced with this dilemma with my first real paycheck, I looked at it and I was like, whew, seems like a lot of money. So being a natural saver, I convinced myself, why don't I do 10% of what I spend? Because what I spend is actually a lot less than what I make. And so that felt good at the time. And anyway, so then, met my now wife, Julia. We were dating for a while. We start going through premarital counseling, and eventually the topic of money comes up. And she looked at me and she's like, well, we're just going to tithe, right? I was like, yeah, we're going to tithe. And that got me over the edge, right? And so your bonus tip for the night is marry someone that thinks well about money. But as we think about our Waldo, but this probably is the one tip that if you're not a Christian, this is absolutely crazy. Right? And we'll talk more about that next week of just how crazy this might be. But the Waldo here for us is just a reminder again that this isn't my money, right? We have to keep that in mind. All right, tip number 3, build a budget. We're moving on to the next bucket of spend strategically. So our biblical inspiration here comes from Proverbs 21. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. So real quick though, what is a budget? If you look, online, you're going to find a real clinical explanation first, that it's an estimate of income and expenditures for a set period of time. And that's true, but I think we need to go a couple steps deeper. I like this quote from John Maxwell. He says, "A budget's telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went." And I would just say a budget's a plan, right? I've worked over my career with a lot of different companies, and I haven't encountered one yet that doesn't have a budget. And in corporate parlance, the word budget and the word plan are often used synonymously. So, I always think, if that's how the best of our business leaders are trained, why would we think our households are any different? Everyone should have a budget across any income level, I would contend this. We could talk about this one all night. These are a few of my thoughts on what might make a successful budget. But the one that maybe I'll just focus on as we kind of talk through this is I think about again, what would I want my kids to really embody as they go about this process is whatever your income level, right? That kind of it starts there. Find a way to be content with as modest of a lifestyle as you can. Ultimately, a modest lifestyle will lead to optionality and freedom, right? How do you make sure you don't have golden handcuffs to a job that you don't really like, even though, just to make sure you can afford a higher lifestyle? Maybe you eventually want to get to a point where you can retire a little bit earlier so you can spend time with your family. It's hard to know exactly how you might feel when you're 22, 23, but think about what that might be and what you might want in the future. And also think about, as we've talked about throughout the series, how do I amplify my impact for the kingdom? And if you can keep that moderate lifestyle and not care what other people think. At the end of this, I'm going to go out to the parking lot and I'm going to get into my 11-year-old Honda CR-V. And that's fine with me. I don't really care if anybody thinks it's not a cool car, right? But it's, I think, a wise use of just kind of keeping expenses low. And by the way, I don't really care about cars, so that helps too. And the last one I would say here is be weird, right? And what I mean by that is if your budget looks exactly like your non-Christian neighbor, you're probably doing something wrong. So where's our Waldo on this tip? I think here it's just a reminder that spending is not going to bring us satisfaction. We saw that clearly last week as we went through some of those texts from Ecclesiastes. And we just always have to, but it's so tempting, right? We all can convince ourselves that the next gadget, the next trinket is going to make our life so much better. But we need to stay rooted on our fulfillment in Christ alone. All right, tip number 4. Things are starting to get spicy here. You guys ready? All right, tip number 4. Avoid debt. This stays within our spend strategically bucket. And you're probably going to say, but Andy, everybody else is doing it. But again, anybody with kids, or if you yourself were a kid, you know that argument doesn't hold much water. As we know, right, we see everybody's social media life, but that's not the whole story. But it's just so normal, isn't it? Well, let's look at what normal looks like in America today. The average U.S. household that has debt has $182,000 of debt. Average person says it takes them 20 years to pay off their student loans. As of last month, the average monthly car payment in America is $811 for a new car. Credit card interest rates are 24%, and 47% of people say they don't pay off their credit cards every month, so they get hit with those prohibitively high interest rates. And 67% of people in this country claim that they live paycheck to paycheck. So maybe it is normal, but I'm not sure we should aspire for normal. We hear a lot of cautionary voices about debt across a lot of different walks of life. We've talked about, this verse from Proverbs 22 about the rich rules over the poor and the borrower is slave to the lender. I like this one from Albert Einstein. He says, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. So the debt is obviously the pays it part. We've got Dave Ramsey. Dave Ramsey, if those of you that know Dave Ramsey, is very, very anti-debt. I like some of Dave Ramsey's stuff. I want to debate him on a few other points, but on this one I agree. The only good debt is paid off debt. Your most powerful wealth-building tool is your income. When you spend your whole life sending loan payments to the banks, you're making everyone else wealthy, and you end up with less to save and invest for your future. And finally, I'll give you one from Charlie Munger. The late Charlie Munger was Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, who says, there's only 3 ways a smart person can go broke: liquor, ladies, and leverage. Leverage is the finance term for debt. All right, but I said I was going to get spicy, and I said at the beginning we're going to try to be practical. So again, love a debate afterwards. But here's my take on some common forms of debt. So what about a house? I do think it's acceptable use, a home mortgage. But I would always challenge someone, the common question that you hear people talk about in personal finance as it comes to buying a house is, how much house can I afford? And I think a better question is, how little house do I need to be happy, right? We shouldn't just stretch and stretch and stretch and extend ourselves. Education, right? I think this is another acceptable use of debt. But my caution would just be, make sure the ROI is there, right? I've heard a lot of people, I was even talking to somebody at work the other day, and they took out $250,000, $300,000 of debt, and then they're like, I want to work a little less, right? And I was like, have you done the math on your, the debt you took on and the income you're now making and how you're going to pay it back? And they're like, nope. And so, I would just say, again, oftentimes a very good investment, but play it forward and make sure the ROI is there. What about the stock market? We're going to talk later in my list of 10 tips about the power of investing in the stock market. But should we take on debt to invest in the stock market? So let's go back to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. You guys have definitely heard of Warren Buffett. You've probably heard of Charlie Munger. But you might not have heard of their third business partner that they had. His name was Rick Guerin. And Buffett said that, Charlie and I always knew we were going to get rich, but Rick was in a hurry. So Rick took on debt, and then when the market plunged, he had to sell his stock in Berkshire Hathaway to Buffett at $40 a share, and he was basically wiped out. And so, Buffett says, it's too dangerous, just be patient, and you'll get there. What about a car? My take is probably more like Ramsey here. I'd say avoid and save in advance and pay cash. And you're going to say, but I don't have enough cash to buy the car that I want. And that might be true. It might not be the car that you want, right? But can you get a car that works with your budget, and then save up in advance, get the power of compounding, and then buy the car, as opposed to buying the car and then coming up with the money? We've got credit cards. I'll disagree with Ramsey here. I'm fine with credit cards as long as you pay them off in full, but please do not get hit with the 24% interest rate. If you can pay it off in full every month, like I have a credit card, I'm happy to get 4% rebate using my U.S. Bank Smartly card when I do buy things, so I'm fine with that, but you got to pay it off. And then buy now, pay later. You guys heard of buy now, pay later? This has kind of really come to be over the last few years in kind of modern consumer finance. And so now you see this little button everywhere, right? Like you can be like, oh, I don't have to pay right now. I can pay for this swimsuit over 4 installments. Isn't this great? I've listened to podcasts of people, a lot of times younger folks that think this is great, right? Like, wow, $150 swimsuit, and I can pay it off in 4 installments. I can make that payment, and they do that now. Then they do it for the next thing, and all of a sudden, a few months down the road, they can barely make the aggregate of all these things that they add up to. And I kid you not, there's ways now where you can finance the purchase of a burrito, right? But if you can't afford to buy the burrito today, maybe you should make a peanut butter and jelly or something, right? So I'd be very, very cautious of that. So again, I guess, where's our Waldo here, right? And my take is, again, it comes back to always reminding ourselves that stuff will not ultimately satisfy, and an encouragement as Christians not to sign away your future freedom. All right, tip number 5. Hold on, you guys got to give me a water break. We're going to move to the next bucket, save aggressively. So my tip number 5 is secure a safety net. So from Proverbs 21 we read, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down." Savings is a buffer for when things go wrong, and things in a broken and fallen world will go wrong, right? So we talked a little bit last week about Joseph and how he helped steward the country of Egypt through first 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, right? And the saving that they did during the 7 years of plenty helped them survive through the 7 long years of famine. I also read a stat the other day that, again, astounded me, that 37% of U.S. households say that they could not cover a $400 emergency expense using cash. And that using cash means that if that happened, right, and they needed the $400, $500, $600, they'd probably have to go into debt, right? So this is kind of correlated and connected to that last point. I recently read this book by Morgan Housel. He said, "Saving is a hedge against life's inevitable ability to surprise the hell out of you at the worst possible moment." So we got to be ready for that, right? I mean, I even debated at one point. I was like, should I include this? It feels, to some extent kind of basic, but it's important and clearly, easy for a number of people to skip. So I think on the practical side, my recommendation is first a little bit of a debt shield, right? We don't want to get thrown into debt. So, how do you scrounge up, $1,000 or $2,500 to make sure that when you're driving down the road and your tire blows, that it doesn't send you into debt? And then ultimately trying to find 3 to 6 months of living expenses so that if you lose your job, again, your life can continue, you can provide for your family, et cetera. Obviously, we want to keep these in liquid, safe investments. You don't want to take your emergency fund and then throw it into the highly volatile asset investment that isn't there for you when you need it. So where's our Waldo, right? Why as Christians should we be kind of especially attuned to this? And I think it's what I said earlier, that a recognition that we live in a fallen and an unpredictable world, and a recognition that things will go wrong. And so we need to be ready for when they do. I don't think this is an act of saying like we don't have faith, right? But if God has given us the resources, stewarding them well ahead of time is preparing for, that moment when things might not go as planned. All right, we're going to move on to invest wisely. So tip number 6 is invest early and often. I think as I walked around, I heard a couple of you saying similar things in your conversations. I love this verse from Proverbs 13, verse 11. "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it." So I have bored my wife to tears over the years talking about the miracle of compounding. A lot of you have probably heard this, but we're going to do it again because it is so, so powerful. Let's read that quote from Einstein again. We read it earlier to make sure we don't go into debt. But Einstein says, "Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. and he who doesn't pays it. We're going to unpack that here in a second. Similarly, Warren Buffett says, life is like a snowball. The important thing is finding wet snow and a really long hill. So let's look at Buffett's really long hill. So if you took $1 and invested that dollar at a 5.5% real return means above and beyond inflation, in 45 years, you would have over $11 in today's dollars, right? Your $1 became over 11. If you give it 40 years, you got 8.5. If you give it 35, you've got 6.5. But if you go to the right-hand side here, right, if you only give it 5 years, your $1 is $1.31. And by the way, if you give me $1 now and you give me no time, it's still worth $1, right? So, our minds, though, every single time I do this, it doesn't matter how many times I look at this, it just doesn't make sense, right? Like our minds are meant to think, are kind of built to think more linearly, right? So when you see something that's growing more exponentially, you just feel that it's wrong, right? Like some of you are probably skeptical looking at this and you're like, I'm sure you did the math wrong. Go do the math and come back and tell me if I'm wrong. But let's make it practical, right? So let's say you've got 3 people. They all graduate college at age 22, and they all want to retire at age 67. So we've got early Evelyn. She's smart. Research has shown that females are better than males at this stuff. So early Evelyn starts at 22. Middle Mike starts at 32, and late Larry starts at 42. Each saves $15,000 per year and gets that 5.5% return above and beyond inflation. So where do they land by the time they get to retirement age? Early Evelyn retires with a portfolio that's worth $2.9 million. Middle Mike, 10 years later, he got on the train, and he's got $1.6 million, basically half of what early Evelyn has. And late Larry joined the party at 42, and at age 67, he has $810,000, over 70% less than early Evelyn. So, this, again, always amazes me. And some of us, you might be looking at this saying, well, I'm not 22 anymore, so, my ship has sailed. But I would say a couple things to that. So one is, if you didn't get this right, tell your kids, tell your grandkids, right? We're talking about, like, how do we want to teach the next generation? And then the second, you guys know the kind of fable, if you will, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago? When's the second best time? Today, right? So let's go. And where's our Waldo here, right? I think, again, thinking about that virtue of humility, for me, think to early Evelyn. What would early Evelyn have to do to make this happen in reality, right? It means at an early age having that modest lifestyle. Everybody else is going off and they're going on this trip, they're buying this car, right? But just kind of having that humility that I don't need all of that, and I'll stay the disciplined path. You guys remember the first rule of Fight Club? We don't talk about Fight Club? All right, we're going back to Charlie Munger here. The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. I saw a headline come across the Wall Street Journal today that said that a lot of people are starting to dip into their 401ks to handle emergency expenses. Guess what that's doing? That's interrupting compounding unnecessarily. All right, tip number 7. Own the whole market at low cost. Our inspiration here comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 11. In verse 2 we read, "Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come upon the land." And then in a few verses later in verse 6, "Sow your seed in the morning, and at evening let your hands not be idle, for you do not know which will succeed, whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well." So own the whole market at low cost. So we got to start first with the market, right? And so the point here is about diversification. So again, go back, do the math, tell me if I'm wrong later, but this always amazes me. If you look at the last 100 years, the U.S. stock market has done tremendously well. If you would have had $1 in 1928 and grow that with inflation averaged 3% over that time period, you would have $19. If instead you invested it in treasury bills, which grew at 3.4%, you would have $26. This is the astounding part. If you would have invested that $1 in the S&P 500 in 1928, in 2025, you would have $11,570. This is crazy, but this is the power of compounding, right? You look at those growth rates and you're like, but wait, the growth rate's only about 3 times more. But instead of 3 times more, you actually have 450 times more by investing in the S&P 500 versus Treasury bills. So the market has done phenomenally well. But I like this research from Hank Bessenbinder. He's a professor of finance at Arizona State University. And he looked at every US company and found that 4%, just 4% of companies account for the entire difference between the return of Treasury bills and the return of the stock market, the total stock market. And to go with that, he found that over 50% of companies have a negative lifetime return. So on the one hand, we have this truth that the stock market has done remarkably well, but we also have this truth that it's really hard to know in advance which particular stocks are going to do well. And if you put all of your money in 1 or 2 of them, you might have a big problem on your hands. So diversification is important. With that, we get a lot of people that are trying to beat the market, right? You've got a lot of money managers out there that are actively trying to figure out which stocks to invest in to beat the market. And again, I think the research is relatively clear here, that if you look over a long enough period of time, so this chart on the left here look out at 15, 20 years, because we're all about compounding, right? Only 2 to 3% of professional money managers are beating the overall market on a risk-adjusted basis. So Warren Buffett famously made a bet a few years ago, and he said, okay, any investment professional, find a portfolio of 5 or more hedge funds, and over 10 years, if they beat the S&P 500, I'll give you $1 million. They eventually said, we'll give the $1 million to a charity of our choosing. Only one firm was brave enough to take him up on his challenge. They didn't even make it the whole 10 years. Midway through, they just conceded the bet and said, you win. That portfolio that they picked got a 2.2% return. The S&P 500 got a 7.1% return. And so absolutely clobbered him. And so I like his quote from Jack Bogle. Jack Bogle was the founder of Vanguard and kind of the father of kind of passive index fund investing. He says, don't look for the needle in the haystack, just buy the haystack. So powerful words. If you're with me so far, it takes us to one more kind of natural conclusion here, which is if you're going to own the whole market, you want to own the market, you want to own the whole thing, and now you want to do it as cheap as humanly possible. And thankfully, this has gotten a lot easier. William Sharpe, he won a Nobel Prize in economics, was a professor at Stanford, and he says, after costs, the average return on the actively managed dollar will be less than the return on the average passively managed dollar. But the other thing I think that's more important here is like, what's really the big deal about fees? So I want to go back to early Evelyn and think about early Evelyn and ask, like, well, what if early Evelyn had to pay 1.5% fees every year? And 1.5%, why do we talk about 1.5%? Well, a common construct in the financial services industry is an advisor that charges 1% assets under management and might put you in a more expensive actively managed fund that's trying to beat the market that might charge another 0.5%, right? So a lot of people do face 1.5%. So early Evelyn, she does exactly the same things, but gets hit with 1.5% fees. And at age 67, instead of having $2.9 million, she has $1.4 million. So 1 to 2% fees, what's the big deal? Over half of her potential wealth is gone. I like this book. One of the guys I follow in this space is Alan Roth. He wrote this book, How a Second Grader Beats Wall Street, and basically argues that, with a few very simple funds, we can do all the things we just talked about, right? We can own the whole market. We can be highly diversified, and we can keep fees very, very low so that we capture more of that long-term benefit. So, he says, a total U.S. stock index fund, a total international fund, and a total bond market fund, basically can get you all the way there, and then just ignore all the other noise, right? So where's our Waldo here, right? Again, we're in a church, right? This is a kind of thinking about faith as well. And I think, again, back to the Christian virtue of humility, It takes a lot of humility to look in the mirror and say, I have no real idea what the stock market's going to do this year. It doesn't matter what degrees I have. It doesn't matter how much time or effort I've put into it. And I don't know better than all these other people that are trying to do the exact same thing that I am, right? That takes humility to say that, but I think the research has shown that people that can have done quite well. All right, tip number 8, we're sticking with investing. Buy, hold, and rebalance. I don't want to get too technical here, but a lot of you have probably heard of, oh, sorry, I skipped. I was so excited. Our biblical inspiration here is Proverbs 25. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. So a lot of you have probably heard of the classic 60-40 portfolio. If you look at, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, this is about asset allocation, just that mix of different asset classes. Sometimes you're talking about a static asset allocation like that. Other times you're talking about a glide path, right? So you see the chart on the left. A lot of times it makes sense for a younger individual to be much higher on stocks, but then kind of taper it down over time. There are a lot of funds now that just do all this work for you, right? So target date retirement funds, enrollment date funds for 529 plans, saving for college, kind of work towards a glide path. You've got balanced funds that just kind of target a set allocation. But here's the beauty of them, right? Let's just use the 60-40 portfolio as an example. If you pick a 60-40 portfolio and the market surges, all of a sudden you check your accounts and you're at 70-30, what do you have to do? You have to sell stock, right? Market surge, you got to sell to get back to 60-40. Let's take it the other way. All of a sudden a COVID-like event happens and the market plunges. You check your accounts and you're 50-50. What do you have to do? You have to buy, right? So this nature of having an allocation and thick or thin sticking with it kind of gets us into a rhythm where we're buying low and selling high. This is the exact opposite of what will feel natural and what most people do. What most people do is the stock market surges and they hear about it and they're like, oh, I should be in stocks, and they buy then, right? I mean, I remember being in conversations when COVID hit and people were like, when are you going to sell? And I was just sitting there going, please don't. And sure enough, a few months later, all those people that sold regretted it, right? A lot of people in finance will say the best asset allocation is the one you can stick with. And again, Warren Buffett's like a quote machine, isn't he? I love what he says. He says, be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy only when others are fearful. This, let's go to our Waldo, though. Where's our Waldo on this? I think this is the epitome of humility, right? Like, how do you look in the mirror when the market's tanking and say, you know what, I'm gonna go buy some now? Or like when everything's going well and everybody wants to get on the train, like you take your foot off the gas a little bit, right? Having a plan, remember that proverb, and being disciplined can force us into good behavior. People that don't have this usually underperform the overall asset because they're buying in and they're selling at the wrong times. Tip number 9. So we're moving on to the next category, steward taxes. In this one, I would just say, to my children, like, you don't have to become a CPA, but it does pay to learn the tax game. We read in Mark chapter 12, Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. I joked last week that it doesn't say render to Caesar more than what's Caesar's, right? So we'll talk a lot about that next week of how do we make sure we're smart as we think about taxes, especially as it relates to giving. The IRS code gives us a lot of potential advantages as it comes to giving and making sure that we're efficient with taxes. But, I'm not going to go through all this now, but the things that I would want to make sure, my kids understand is like just the basics of like we live in a country with a progressive tax structure, right? I was really excited. My daughter came home from her co-op a couple months ago, and they're doing a unit on personal finance. And so I nerded out, and I was like, oh, let me see, and I looked through it. And it said, oh, you make this much, and then you pay, you're in this bracket, so 15% of the income goes to taxes. I was like, that's not how it works, right? Like the first bucket, you pay this %. Then the next bucket, you pay this. And then I was lost, right? I was like, all right, we'll cover this later. She was only 10. But understanding just general principles of taxes. So like a few things that, again, I'd want to teach my kids are, be cognizant of the difference between preferred tax rates on capital gains, long-term capital gains versus ordinary income. Don't go sell stock, 11 and a half months after you bought it, when if you just wait 2 more weeks, you could get a better tax deal, right? Like, some principles will help you know how to act. What's the difference between a deduction and a credit? The standard versus itemized deduction. This next one's really important. There's a lot of different tax-advantaged accounts out there. If you know about them, you can save yourself a lot of money, right? You've got 401ks and IRAs. There's traditional versions, Roth versions. You've got 529s. You've got HSAs. You've got UTMA accounts for minors, right? There's all sorts of different account types that can help us save on taxes. What are payroll taxes? What's the difference between withholding versus the true tax liability that I'm going to owe the government, right? I talk to a lot of adults who don't necessarily know crisp answers to this, which is fine, right? But take the time, if you take the time to learn it, I think it can save you over the long term. So where's our Waldo, right? I think this is really one about, if I can learn here and get more tax efficient, a conviction that we can use that knowledge and that efficiency to amplify the impact that we have on the kingdom. And then my last and final tip is under this navigate uncertainty bucket, and that is set your house in order. In 2 Kings chapter 20, we read, "And Isaiah the prophet came to him and said, 'Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die, you shall not recover.'" Don't get confused by the order of my presentation tonight. I was trying to keep us linearly moving through the framework, but this is probably the first thing that a lot of people in this room need to go home and think about. So there are 4 kind of general buckets that I wanted to call out. Again, trying to keep this super practical. Core estate planning, right? You have to work with a estate planning attorney here, whether that's trust or wills, making sure you have a power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, living will, update beneficiary designations. This one sounds so basic, but if you talk to anybody that spends time in financial planning, they will either have direct or indirect horror stories to tell you. So, fun fact, your beneficiary designations on retirement accounts supersede anything that's in your trust or your wills. So you hear stories about people that got divorced 20 years ago, and then they die, and most of their money goes to their ex-spouse that they haven't talked to in 20 years because they didn't have these documents updated. So core estate planning, I'd say beyond that, there's this concept of like prep and everything file, right? Like, how do you make it easier for those that survive you to kind of put your life to rest with dignity, right? So having that list of financial accounts, insurance policies, end-of-life wishes, what do you want to happen to your body? Do you maybe even write your own obituary, right? How do you, modern things we have to think about, right? Like, how do they get into your phone, right? Like, how do they get into your digital accounts? What about your email, right? Like, I mean, there's so much information in my email, but if nobody has access to it, they can't do anything with it. The next bucket, just to quickly highlight, is insurance. Insurance needs are highly specific, so we can't really have a general blanket rule here. There's probably some people in this room that don't have a term life insurance policy that should, and there's others that are still paying for a life insurance policy that they probably don't need. I was talking with a client recently who was very eager to ask me about sexy topics like, well, what about direct indexing and what that could mean for optimized tax loss harvesting? But under a little bit of further conversation, discovered that he and his wife had 2 young kids. They hadn't updated their wills since they had children, so there's no documentation of who should take care of the kids upon their death if something were to happen. And neither one of them had any sort of life insurance in place, and they probably should, right? So these things are super foundational and important, but they're definitely not sexy. And then the last one is, cybersecurity protection. So, I think here, again, you've worked hard in your life. Just take the right precautions to make sure that that you don't get things stolen from you, right? So, basic guidance around, having strong passwords, 2-factor authentication. Do you get text messages every time money moves out of your accounts? ACATS transfer lock. Most of you have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me tell you a story I read about the other day. Fraudsters now can get a lot of information about you, right? And so somebody set up a fake brokerage account in somebody else's name. Somehow got the Social Security number and so forth, and they basically initiated a transfer to transfer a bunch of someone's assets out of their real account to this fake one that they had set up. Assets transferred over, they instantly liquidated it, transferred the money into a bank account that they owed, and all of a sudden, like, that person's money and assets were gone. But it was worse than that, because in their name, this fraudster had sold all of their assets, triggered huge capital gains, and so all of a sudden this person had none of their assets and an enormous tax bill, right? So there are things that you can do, like setting up your account with these type of transfer locks to make sure that nobody can transfer out your assets out of your accounts. And then just, being aware of scammers in general, right? Like, you couldn't list all the different scams out there, right? But just kind of always being on your guard, especially as we get older in age. We know scammers tend to focus on the older population. So where's our Waldo here? I think for me, it's just a recognition. It fits well with the season of Lent that we're in. To dust we shall return, right? And so to be cognizant of our own mortality, and to make sure that we've got plans in place. All right, I think we're right at time. So I'm going to wrap it up. We do have handouts for you at the end as you walk out tonight that kind of summarize the 10 tips that we talked about tonight. So feel free to grab one. Like I said, I fully anticipate that some of you want to take me up on an argument about one or two of these. So come on up, let's have at it. And I would just say, be prayerful, stay wise, stay humble, and come next week and we'll talk about how to give. Sam?
Awesome. Can we give it up for Andy? Really great job. That was amazing. Super practical. Take him up on his offer. Come speak to him after. Debate him. I know he's going to love that. But Andy, thank you so much for all the work you put into that. That was, you can't even put a price tag on how good that advice is, and to be doing that of your own time and volition. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And excited for next week. Be sure that you're back next week to join us as we're wrapping up our series on wisdom in your wallet. And then just a reminder that we have those QR codes at the back for our Ask Your Pastors Anything night that we have coming up, and as well as a QR code for the schedule for Holy Week, so that you can know everything that we have going on. And then, like Andy said, we have that printout that he has prepared that has those 10 tips listed out. They are also on that back table for you, so feel free to take one of those with you. And then we always have that QR code for our midweek list. So if you want to know more about what's going on, want to keep up to date with what's happening here at midweek, you can scan that QR code so that you can be on our emailing list. Pastor Sean, would you mind coming up and giving us a blessing? Would you please stand and receive this blessing? It's from the Lord.
Just to echo what Sam just said, that teaching is so good. And last week and this week, it's something that as I was listening to it, I'm thinking, man, we got to get this. We got to teach this to the youth group somehow. They need to hear it now. We need to teach this in life groups. We need this all over the place. Such good wisdom and practical teaching. Thank you so much. So just receive this blessing from the Lord as you prepare to go tonight. We do have refreshments out there. I think you mentioned that, Sam, so feel free to hang out for a while. But go get your kids. Now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you his peace. Now go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.